Welcome to Season 5 of the Long-Winded One podcast. Listen as we showcase original work from top Royal Road authors read by professional voice actors. Hear interviews from your favourite lit RPG and game lit authors. Lastly, listen as the Long-Winded One tries his hand at his first ever lit RPG novel, The Four Treasures.
Excerpt of Enigmatic Bard's Journey, written by Beam, read by Jenna Rose. Karsten Meir was standing high up on what looked like the skeleton of an old farmhouse, trying to keep himself balanced on narrow, layered planks that he had studiously found out is called the top plate of the house frame. In his right hand there was a hammer, and in his left there was a nail. Clenching the hammer tightly so as not to drop it, he raised it high above his head and carefully made sure the nail was where, he believed, it was supposed to be, at the same time making sure his grip on the pole didn't falter. A fall from this height would not serve him well, he reckoned. Then, putting all his strength into it, he swung the hammer, and the hammer struck true. It hit the mark right in the middle of the cuticle of the nail on his left thumb, severing the nail from the finger entirely in an astounding display of unintended precision and force. Curses flew from Karsten's mouth as he yanked his left hand back from the pole and promptly lost his balance. While falling to the ground, he had but a split second to think about his own stupidity before his head was thoroughly impaled by a thin metal pole protruding from the foundation, in one temple and out the other. His last words were thus, "Shit, shit, 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 shit." If Karsten had had time to reflect upon this exclamation, he would have thought back to the times he'd sometimes pondered what his last words would be. Although he recognized that, realistically, there'd likely not be much time to mull over what to say when the end was actually upon you, he at least didn't want these words to be something too unceremonious. Oh well. Landing headfirst on the ground with an audible grunt and a cacophony of coughs, Karsten didn't immediately try to get up. He laid there motionlessly for a time, but quickly regained some of his senses and noticed that he was lying in a deep puddle of cold, coarse mud. He put his hands under his torso and pushed himself to his feet with a jolt. There, he was met with a sweeping wave of vertigo and staggered, barely caught himself, and then proceeded to gracelessly fall backwards into a bush, disappearing from sight. Sprawled out on the wet ground, Karsten then noticed something strange about himself that sent his mind whirling in a hurricane of confusion. "I'm alive?" His voice was disgruntled and barely a whisper, and his mind was churning out thoughts at a snail's pace. Still, the analytical half of his brain wouldn't let the matter go. Karsten remembered the sinking feeling of dread he'd felt as he fell from the roof only moments before. Face-planting from the second story of a building was not something people were known to be able to survive. Well, except for Karsten's great-grandfather, of course, who could be run over by a train and go back to working at the mill the day after. The guy was a tank. When he eventually died, his family was shocked because something actually managed to kill him, though apparently they weren't even sure what that was exactly. Still, Karsten had no idea how he himself was still alive. His great-grandfather had his built-up physique to thank for his survival. Karsten wasn't someone who'd built tenacious muscle from a life of hard physical labor. He was strong for his age, yes, but he wasn't that strong. He also remembered where he'd fallen. Very hesitatingly, Karsten's fingers reached up to touch his temples. He then stopped as his left thumb came into view and cringed at the sight of a finger missing a nail. There was a dull ache, but it didn't hurt all that much to Karsten's glee. He turned his attention back to his temples. They were, as far as he could tell, not impaled, but there was something different about them. The skin was uneven in the same place on both sides of his head. They felt like uneven circles, and both were almost 1 centimeter in diameter. Karsten imagined they would look somewhat like one of the moon's craters if seen from another person's perspective. But Karsten only focused on one fact as he looked at his hands. There was not even a drop of blood. His very lethal injury had healed in the blink of an eye, leaving no trace other than the scars. But how was that possible? The image of the steel pole closing in on him as he fell was engraved onto his bones. There was no way that that was just imagined. He remembered pulling his eyes away and closing them last second, turning his head, as if that would protect him. After that, there was the briefest flash of light, and he landed here, wherever this was. His heart started pounding in his chest the more he thought about the absurdity of the situation, and his vision turned hazy. His breath quickened, and his hands turned clammy, like they were drained of blood. Karsten looked around himself, but found he couldn't focus on what he was seeing. Not that there was currently anything other than tall grass around him where he was laying anyway, but even that suddenly only looked like a blur.
Bloody hell!
Karsten chuckled. He rubbed his hands together and lifted himself off the ground a second time, blinking the haze away and taking some deep breaths.
Honestly, what is up with my vestibulars today? Just falling from the 2nd story of a building? Well, yeah, that'll do it.
A weak smile flashed across his face as he looked down at his still trembling hands. He took a few deep breaths, and when the shaking had mostly died down, he raised his head again, this time finally taking in his surroundings.
Wow!
It was the most lush forest Karsten had ever seen. Trees towered so high he couldn't clearly make out the canopy, though if that was because of his residual stress or not, he couldn't tell. The bark of the skyscraper trees was black and looked almost sandpapery. It, as well as everything else, was also wet, so it had evidently just rained. The grass was a shade of green that felt like it was healing some part of him just by looking at it. But the most shocking part of the scenery was by far the canopy. Many plants were similar to plants he'd encountered at home, but these had an unmistakable alienness to them. Some looked like bushes of miniature bamboo trees with black leaves, but instead of having straight leaves, they curved in a spiral manner that made them look like goth confetti. Some vine-like plants were coiling dozens of meters up the skyscraper trees, and looked somewhat like a mix of philodendron and monstera plants, but with pale yellow dots spotting them. There were clusters of extravagant flowers that would have looked pleasantly stunning, if not for the fact that the orange and yellow pollen finger things in the center of the flowers were squirming, albeit happily. It looked like they were waving at him. Karsten subdued a tremor that rose within him, and vehemently decided to avoid that batch of alien flowers for now. Swiftly stepping past them, he started trotting through the woods in a random direction. He was conflicted on whether he wanted to move at all or not, but in the end concluded that staying in the same place would be a bad idea based on, well, nothing really. But his anxiety was pushing him to do something, so he strolled forwards at a leisurely pace. Looking this way and that as he ventured through the forest, the scenery both astounded and unnerved him. The forest/swamp? Marshland? No, that's not quite right. It's too hilly here. Was truly beautiful. Streaks of sunlight shone through the carpet of leaves far above, illuminating the colorful biome that was the forest. All sorts of mushrooms littered the ground and, together with the colorful alien flowers, made a breathtaking scene that looked like the century-in-the-making masterpiece of some god-turned gardener. There were supersized roots everywhere, snaking through the vegetation deceptively, and they were Karsten's first enemy in this world. Some places they even protruded from the ground to form arches even taller than Karsten was. It made for the perfect setting for a high fantasy adventure, but made for very, very poor footing. He half jumped, half tripped, over a particularly thick bush of the goth confettis, and one of the evidently razor-sharp leaves brushed over the exposed flesh of his left thumb.
Oh, ew, no.
Karsten yanked his hand to his chest and cringed.
disgusting.
He put pressure on the tip of his thumb to drive the sensation away, which did absolutely nothing.
Can nails grow back from nothing? Oh, God.
Ducking under a root arch, curses flew yet again as his foot slipped on a mossy rock, simultaneously being hit in the face by a big leaf.
Christ!
His words caught in his throat as he looked at the leaf that had just hit him. It was spinning. In fact, all of the leaves he could see were spinning evenly, in either a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction, so as not to knock into the other spinning leaves. The plant looked hypnotizing, and Karsten wondered what purpose evolving such a trait would serve. Ducking under the leaf again as it finished another rotation, he shuffled away, stealing a second glance at the plant as he went. Karsten started humming under his breath to distract himself. He tried not to think about how he'd gotten here or why he was suddenly trudging through this alien forest. Dwelling too deeply on it would spur the panic he'd felt earlier, and that wouldn't do him any good in this place. If the foreboding feeling that what was happening was actually happening was correct, he needed to set his priorities straight. He reflected on this as he walked. In the end, his top priority was thus: find other people. This has been Enigmatic Bard's Journey, written by Beam, read by Jenna Rose, produced for Season 5 of the Long-Winded One podcast. The author and/or any present or future publishing company retains all of the rights for the associated work. This work was read by permission of the author. I'm Jenna Rose, an experienced queer and non-binary voice actor specializing in character work and narration. You can find more information about me on my website, www.jrosereads.com, as well as on my Twitter account, @jrosereads, and Blue Sky account, @jrosereads.bsky.social, and my LinkedIn profile, Jenna Rose Geyser. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us down this Lit RPG deep dive. Please consider giving us a review on Apple Podcasts and visit us over at longwinded.one, where you can see past episodes and find all of our socials, even our new Discord server. We hope you enjoy.